Right now, while most of the world is debating school rankings and career paths and whether to move closer to the city or farther away from it, there is a village in the South Atlantic where childhood still looks the way it looked 3 generations ago. Not perfectly, not frozen, not sealed inside glass, but close enough that a child born there today can still walk the same road, pass the same houses, sit in the same school, eat the same food from the same ground, and grow up inside a rhythm of life their great-grandparents would recognize without explanation. One settlement, one school, one harbor, one church, one hall where the whole community fits, cliffs behind, ocean ahead, and a quiet question hanging over all of it, not whether this life is old, but whether it can outlive the children now inheriting it. This is Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, the only settlement on Tristan da Cunha, described by the island's own official website as the world's most isolated settlement. All resident islanders live here, in a single village on the north coast, beneath cliffs rising roughly 800 meters above them. Tristan da Cunha Settlement. And if you hear the population number, your brain almost refuses to take it seriously. 221 resident islanders as of 2026. That is not a town. It is barely a school assembly, barely 2 subway cars, barely enough to fill one side of a wedding hall, and yet 221 people are holding together a way of life that most of the modern world surrendered decades ago. Family news, which raises the question that sits beneath this entire story. How much longer? How much longer can a village this small sustain itself? How much longer can tradition be passed on when the children receiving it can now see everything the outside world has to offer? How much longer can staying feel like a natural choice rather than a sacrifice? And maybe the hardest question of all, what happens when the last generation who knew this life as ordinary grows up and moves on? Because that is what this title really means. Their children will be the last to live this way, not the last to visit, not the last to remember, the last to live it, to wake up inside it every day without having to explain it to themselves, to understand it not as heritage, not as history, not as something preserved for others to admire, but as Tuesday, as breakfast, as the walk to school, as the sound of wind against the same cliffs, as the dog outside the same door, or as the neighbor whose name you have known since before memory. That kind of life does not announce its own disappearance. It just gets thinner, quieter, harder to reproduce, until one day someone realizes it is no longer being lived. It is being remembered. To understand why that matters here, you have to understand how complete the old system still is. Tristan da Cunha is not simply a place where people happen to live far from everyone else. It is a community with its own internal logic, its own economy, its own moral structure, built over generations. The official island economy is still based on subsistence farming and fishing for local food. Foreign income comes from the commercial Tristan rock lobster industry, stamps, coins, handicrafts, and limited tourism. Every family is involved in farming. All land is communally owned. Stock numbers are controlled. No outsiders are allowed to buy land or settle. Economy read that list again. Subsistence farming, communal land, controlled wealth, closed settlement. That is not a lifestyle brochure. That is a social philosophy. A philosophy that says, this place belongs to the people who live here, not to investors, not to developers, not to anyone who arrives with money and plans, to the people whose families built these houses, dug these fields, fished these waters, and raised these children inside this one village for over 200 years. And the way people work here reflects that philosophy. Adults combine salaried government jobs with fishing, farming, building, repairs, domestic work, and helping neighbors. Women hold government roles, process crawfish in the factory, and have served as chief islander and head of school. Children and pensioners are involved in farming. Family groups take days off together for gathering trips to nearby islands. Economy. That is not a fragmented modern economy. That is a whole life. A life where labor is visible, where food is connected to hands and soil, where a house is something you build or repair yourself, where helping your neighbor is not charity. It is architecture, the architecture of survival. And children growing up here still see that architecture with their own eyes. They see potatoes pulled from the ground. They see fish brought to shore. They see fences repaired before weather turns. They see cargo unloaded from ships that only come a few times a year. They see adults carrying multiple roles because a village of 221 cannot afford specialists who only do one thing. They see the whole system. And that is exactly what makes this generation so historically important, because they may be the last ones who see it as normal. Now think about the school. St. Mary's School educates Tristan children between the ages of 3 and 16. It has 5 classrooms, a library, a hall with stage, a computer suite, a cookery room, and a craft and science room. School. That matters, not because it is impressive by mainland standards, because it tells you that this community is not hiding from the future. Its children use computers. They study in classrooms. They learn about the world beyond the horizon. They are being prepared, and preparation is exactly where the danger begins. Because the more clearly a child can imagine the outside world, the harder it becomes to assume they will spend their whole life inside this one village. That is not a moral failure. It is simply what education does. It widens, it opens, it shows alternatives. And once alternatives are visible, staying stops being the default path of adulthood. It becomes a choice, and choices can go either way. Think about what that means for a settlement of 221. In a city of millions, a few hundred people leaving changes nothing. In a village of 221, a few dozen leaving changes everything. The school gets smaller. The workforce gets thinner. The skills concentrate in fewer households. The routines that once involved everyone start depending on a shrinking circle of people willing to remain. The community still looks the same from the outside. Same houses, same church, same cliffs, same fields. But inside, the chain is narrowing, and chains break at their thinnest point. That fear is built directly into the numbers. The settlement page notes extraordinary continuity. Present residents descending from original settlers, with only 7 family surnames surviving among current islanders: Glass, Swain, Green, Rogers, Hagen, Repetto, Lavarello. Each name tied to a specific founder, a specific year of arrival, a specific nationality. Settlement, 7 surnames. 221 people. 1 village. That is not a population. That is a family tree shaped like a place. And family trees do not survive by sentiment. They survive by people staying, having children, raising them, teaching them, and trusting that enough of those children will choose to remain inside the system that raised them. That trust is what may be ending. Not because the children are ungrateful, not because they hate this place, but because the modern world taught them something earlier generations never fully knew. that there are other options, larger schools, broader careers, easier transport, bigger hospitals, more privacy, more anonymity, more entertainment, more distance from the constant closeness of a village where every face has a history attached to it. Once a child knows those things exist, staying becomes a decision that has to be made every day, and not every child will keep making it. Now think about what the island has already survived. In 1961, a volcanic eruption forced the evacuation of the entire population, where the earth shook. A new cone formed behind the settlement. Lava destroyed the factory and the landing beaches. 264 islanders and 31 expatriates were taken first to Cape Town, then to England. The British government assumed the move was permanent. Officials expected the islanders to stay. Jobs were provided. Schools were available. Housing was arranged. The booming consumer society of early 1960s England stood open before them. 1961 to 1963, volcanic interlude, and the community voted 148-5 to go home. They returned to a volcano-ravaged settlement. They rebuilt. They stayed. The island's own history page uses a phrase that tells you everything. The community returned, rejecting the booming consumer society of England's swinging 60s. 1961 to 1963, volcanic interlude. That is the deepest proof of what belonging means here. These people saw the modern world from the inside, lived in it, worked in it, sent their children to its schools, and still chose home. Not because they were ignorant, because they were clear. But here is the difficult truth. Returning after disaster is not the same thing as reproducing a way of life indefinitely. That return happened in 1963, more than 60 years ago. The community that came back was united by shared exile, shared trauma, and a shared longing powerful enough to override every material advantage England could offer. The children growing up on Tristan now do not share that experience. They have not been exiled and returned. They have not been forced to choose. They are simply growing up in a place that feels normal to them, and gradually learning that normal here is extraordinary everywhere else. That is a very different emotional landscape, because exile produces fierce loyalty, but comfort produces options, and options, once available, cannot be unfelt. A ship still takes about 6 days from Cape Town. Passenger space is limited. Landings depend on weather. Some vessels carry only up to 12 passengers. Travel can be delayed or bumped by medical emergencies or official priorities. Shipping. That means the island is still physically cut off in a way few places on Earth remain. But physical isolation no longer seals a community the way it once did. The internet crosses oceans faster than ships. Education crosses oceans faster than cargo. Aspiration crosses oceans faster than anything. And a child sitting in a computer suite at St. Mary's School can now see, with their own eyes, the scale of the world they are not part of. That is not a failure of the community. It is the price of preparing children well. The school exists because the island cares about its future. The computer suite exists because the community is not naive about the world. The education is real because the people here believe their children deserve it. But every tool that helps a child imagine a better future is also a tool that makes departure more thinkable. That is the cruel paradox of small places in the modern world. The things that prove you care about the next generation are the same things that may cause the next generation to leave. So what does it actually feel like to grow up here now? You walk to school along a road your grandparents walked. You sit in a classroom with children whose surnames are the same 7 surnames the village has carried since the 1800s. You learn math and science and language. You use a computer. You look out the window and see cliffs your ancestors saw. You come home and help with livestock. You eat food from the ground you helped tend. You attend gatherings in the same hall where the whole village fits. You know everyone. Everyone knows you. Your strengths are public. Your struggles are public. Your family's history is not a genealogy project. It is the structure of everyday life. And then one day, through a screen or a book or a visiting teacher or a cousin who left, you see another version of life. A version with airports, cities, universities, hospitals that are not one modest building. Careers that do not require you to also fish and farm and repair your own house. Privacy, anonymity, the ability to be unknown, the ability to fail quietly, the ability to become someone new. That comparison does not have to be hostile to be powerful. A child does not need to reject Tristan to be pulled toward elsewhere. They just need to feel that elsewhere has room for a version of themselves that the island, by its very smallness, cannot fully contain. And that is the deeper tragedy hidden inside the title. Not that children will hate this way of life, but that they may love it and still be unable to remain within it. Because a village of 221 does not only need love to survive, it needs numbers, skills, marriages, births, teachers, fishermen, administrators, builders, nurses, were people willing to accept the closeness, the limits, the lack of anonymity, the reality that almost every adult will live as part of a highly visible social fabric where absence is felt, contribution is noticed, and there is nowhere to disappear. Economy, family news. That is a heavy thing to ask of any generation, and yet that is exactly what continuity requires. Not grand gestures, repetition, waking up in the same wind, tending the same ground, repairing the same houses, recognizing the same surnames, walking to the same harbor, waiting for the same ships, accepting that home can be both comforting and demanding at once. In a big city, one person can vanish into the machinery. On Tristan, one person is the machinery, and when enough people leave the machinery slows, then stops, not dramatically, or quietly. One fewer student in the classroom, one fewer pair of hands at harvest, one fewer voice in the hall, one fewer family surname on the population list, and eventually a way of life that survived volcanic eruption, British exile, centuries of ocean isolation, and the entire weight of the modern world pressing from the outside. That way of life begins to end, not with a collapse, with a whisper. So will their children be the last to live this way? Maybe, maybe not entirely. Tristan will probably continue. The village will probably still stand. Some families will probably remain. But the question is not whether the place survives. The question is whether the life survives. The specific life, the communal farming, the shared labor, the flexible work that moves between government, fishing, building, and a neighborly help in the same week. The social closeness so deep that every person carries weight. The inherited knowledge of how to live where you are, with what you have, among people who cannot be replaced by strangers. That life depends on continuity so exact that even small breaks matter. You can preserve buildings. You can preserve surnames. You can preserve photographs and archives and stamps. But preserving a way of life means preserving habits, obligations, mutual dependence, the unspoken understanding that showing up is not optional, and those are much harder to pass on, Once alternatives become visible, communities do not have to remain unchanged to remain themselves, but some things will be lost even in the best version of the future. The feeling of a fully self-reproducing village culture, the assumption that children will grow into the same world that raised them, the confidence that this life can renew itself without compromise, that is what may be ending. Not Tristan, but innocence about Tristan. The belief that remoteness alone can preserve a human way of life forever. Because remoteness no longer seals anything off completely. It only slows the pace of transformation, and perhaps that is why this story resonates far beyond one island. Tristan da Cunha is an extreme case, but the question it faces is universal. What happens when a life built on continuity meets a world built on options? What survives when children inherit both belonging and choice? How many of the old patterns can remain once staying must compete with everything else the modern world can offer? In one sense, this is a story about a remote South Atlantic village of just over 200 people. In another, it is a story about nearly every traditional community on Earth. The details differ. The pressure feels familiar. No child asks for the responsibility of preserving a civilization. Yet some inherit it anyway. On Tristan da Cunha, beneath those cliffs, beside that cold harbor, inside that one small school and that one small settlement, children are growing up inside one of the rarest social worlds still left. They may not preserve it exactly. History suggests nobody preserves anything exactly. But they are close enough to its older form to be the last generation who can say they truly knew what it felt like, before continuity gave way to adaptation, before staying became a conscious decision rather than a natural fact, before the village still stood but the life inside it had quietly changed. And maybe that is the real meaning of the title, not a prophecy of doom, not a sentimental line about a vanishing island, but a recognition that some generations stand on a threshold, invisible to themselves while they are living through it. They milk the cows, walk to school, wait for ships, help with repairs, listen to older relatives, grow up in houses built by parents or grandparents, see the whole village at once, and only later does history look back and say, they were the last children to know that world as ordinary. After them, it was still there, but it was never quite the same again.